Hello, and welcome to the Light of Navigation, where God's love, hope, and goodness is found in any storm. My name is Marguerite, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. And don't forget to share this video if it will bless someone you know. I deeply appreciate it when you click that like and subscribe button. Thank you for allowing me to share a great short story with you today. The account I'm about to share with you is about a supernatural banquet, a feast with God I was invited to. And it's about how God prepares us ahead of time for a need in the near future. After watching the last of a video series at church about the importance of family, our pastor asked us all a question. What was supper like in our homes as children growing up? The supper table sets the tone for the knitting together of a family and its relationships. Several people shared their experiences, and most were pleasant. And I debated as I sat there whether to speak up at all on this issue, and I didn't. As a child, and for most of my adult life, coming to the supper table was an experience that was deeply dreaded each evening. I remember staying outside playing as long as I could as a child to put off coming inside to sit at the table when dinner was announced. As we sat to eat, the evening meal was fraught with verbal and emotional abuse and sometimes physical attack. My father was a critical alcoholic and did not hesitate to strike out at anyone. Quite frankly, it was a nightmare. I dreaded it. The best strategy was just to keep quiet and hope we would be overlooked for any incoming abuse. Again, I dreaded those evening meals. On the other hand, I experienced a supernatural banquet with God in my life too, as well. In the scriptures, God speaks of sitting at his table and dining with him. There is the great banquet spoken of in Isaiah 25:6 after Jesus' return. And Christ spoke of knocking on the door of our lives and hearts, inviting him in, and he would dine with us on a personal level. And that's in Revelation 3:20. The God banquet I was invited to and attended occurred in April of 1988. My husband Randy, his name actually was George Randall, he was a lineman and he worked frequently out of state. He was working on a job at Fort Story in Virginia. My son Randall and I were staying with my parents in the Seattle area for a time. We were visiting. I was working there temporarily also to help pay off some of our debts. Randy and I had planned on reuniting back at our home based in Florida when his job was finished in Virginia. And to give more background here, at the age of 12, my husband had experienced a move of God while attending a youth camp. A deep conviction to become a minister of the gospel had come to him, but out of fear, however, he did not follow through with God's plan in his life. Randy continued to live life on his terms and not God's. I had been praying for some time that he would return to the Lord with his whole heart and follow God once again. 2 weeks before his current job was due to end, and during a nightly phone conversation, he asked me a question. He said to me, "Marguerite, I'm tired of living my life the way I've been living it, and I want to know Christ in my life again. Can you help me?" I was surprised and ecstatic. This was an answer to prayer, a dream come true. Here he was on the phone with me, voicing how God had turned his heart toward him once again. We then briefly talked about finding work locally for him in our home state of Florida, which is where our home base was. In 2 more weeks, I thought, my husband would not be on the road anymore, and with a heart following God again. He offered to quit his job early to join us. Now, I knew how much my husband loved his line work. With only these 2 weeks left on the current job he was at, I encouraged him to finish it and then return home again. I could not wait. I was stunned and I was grateful. Grateful that God had been moving upon his heart to return to a relationship with Christ in his life again. In the 2 weeks that followed, I began to experience visitations from the Lord as I slept at night. And I was aware that he was speaking to me for long periods of time through the entire night. They were lengthy conversations of some sort, but I could not remember what had been said, and when I woke the next morning, I was totally baffled. I knew that God was downloading something of importance to me that would be needed in the future. I had never had this kind of encounter with God before, though, quite like this. What struck me the most when this occurred was the feeling that I woke up with the next day. It was as though I had sat down at a great banquet all night long with the Lord. And his words, they were feeding me as he spoke them. Each morning I felt a fullness and a satisfaction that even now it's difficult to describe. There was absolute contentment that came along with it. And when I would get up the next morning, I had the deepest, most profound satisfaction of spirit and soul I've ever known. His words were food. This was an ongoing multi-night banquet I attended in spirit in my sleep for those following 2 weeks. The impact of the nightly visitations prompted me to share the experiences with my mother, and needless to say, neither one of us knew what to make of it. The last night of these visitations was different than the rest, however. In this dreaming, on this night, I was standing in a dark place, and it was pitch black. Then suddenly, a bright light came down on top of me from above, kind of like someone on a stage when a light is turned on up above them. As the light hit me, I fell to my knees. In that light was the manifest presence of God, and I could not stand before him. My knees hit the ground like a sack of rocks. I even shifted downward in my bed as I fell down to my knees in the dream. Two emotions ran through me at the same time as God's presence manifested himself in those moments. There was a deep terror or fear of the Lord, and at the same time, a mix of the love of God, which is not born of the human mind or soul. It startled me greatly. When I briefly woke up immediately afterwards, the same manifest presence was in my bedroom for several minutes, just as it was in the dream. 2 weeks later, on May 6th, the last day of the company's job at Fort Story in Virginia, and 1 hour before quitting time, my husband was killed. He had accidentally touched one of the power lines he was working on, and he had been electrocuted. When I was told of my husband's death, and as I sat in my parents' home on that May afternoon, I was brought the day's mail in the middle of the grief and shock that had followed. Mother's Day cards had arrived. Mother's Day was 6 days away, and Randy had sent cards ahead of time. There was one from my mother and one also for me. In addition, there were carefully wrapped gifts for our son for his 4th birthday as well, which was on the 18th. All of it had arrived the same day of his death. As I entered the funeral home in Florida to make arrangements a few days later, I was asked if I wanted to see my husband's body to make sure everything was in order for the scheduled viewing that evening. I had dreaded this, facing death for the first time in my life like this, looking at his face to see the lifeless body of someone I loved. I was a young 32-year-old, and I had never faced a sudden death before. I entered the room where his body was and noticed immediately that my husband's face was too pale. There's a natural paleness from death, but this color was from a well-intentioned mortician's application of facial makeup that was several shades too light. Randy was a deeply tanned individual. His blonde hair and blue eyes belied his American Indian heritage, which caused him to tan quite easily. I pointed this out to the mortician and directed him for several minutes on reapplying the darker shade of makeup so my husband's face had a more natural appearance. There was a guiding, supernatural calmness and peace that I had never known or experienced before. There was no falling apart emotionally, no fear or dread for the 20 minutes of the time that it took. Afterwards, I walked out onto the steps on the outside of the funeral home to try and take it all in, what I had just walked through. The moment I stood in the sunshine on those steps, the content of God's nightly 2-week visitations flooded my mind. A recall came forward of what God had been saying and doing. I realized I had been through several rehearsals those 2 weeks before, in my sleep from the Holy Spirit. A rehearsal of what I had just walked through. A supernatural strengthening had occurred beforehand. God had already walked me through those 20 minutes as I looked at the death of my husband for the first time. God had been preparing me beforehand to be able to physically face my husband's death. I know that I would not have had the emotional strength and courage as well needed to walk into that room where my husband's body was, much less redirect the mortician on the reapplication of the facial makeup. The preparatory visitations of God sustained me through my first face-to-face experience with death. The stunning encounter of God's presence on the last night of that 2-week period, where I dropped to my knees in holy fear and awe, the memory of that encounter carried me through the entire journey of my husband's death with the revelation truth that God is real, and He is. When my pastor asked that simple question that he did, those are the memories that came to my mind. I will never forget the satisfaction I felt that superseded any earthly kind when I dined with God. I've known the table of love, and I've known the table of dread. And I look forward to the table of God's love, the great banquet in my eternal future again. You know, I'm sure you've wondered about the Frogman in this story's title, and where such a strange thing would fit in. As I sat in the airport lobby, waiting for our flight home to bury my husband, our son skipped over to the nearby airport store a few feet away to look around. My husband had the tendency to buy our son Randall the cheapest, cheesiest toys you can imagine in those airport stores when we traveled together over the years. It was just how he rolled. Of course, our son had developed the expectation of an airport toy every time we were in one. I noticed a large fish tank in the store window with a battery-operated Frogman, like a G.I. Joe doll, dressed in diving gear and swimming around in it. I also saw my son eyeballing it with rapt attention. It was comical, really. And of course, Randall ran back out of the store to me and promptly asked me for the toy. He wanted me to buy it for him. It was difficult, but I had to tell him no. What little money I had was needed for expenses on our flight home. Being spoiled by his dad on these types of purchases in the past, I just knew a temper tantrum was coming. There was no doubt. But for the first time ever, he didn't stomp his feet. He didn't pitch a fit in protest as he would usually do. I was genuinely surprised by his calm acceptance of my answer instead. It was noticeable to me, and it struck me as very odd and out of character at the time. Randall ran back into the store to look around one more time as our flight was almost ready to board. The second time he returned to our seating area, he quietly sat down. And then several minutes later, he turned to me and he said, "Mommy, when I was in the shop, Daddy told me he loved me." I was dumbfounded and shocked. And then I broke down and I wept sitting there in that airport terminal. When he had stood in the airport store the second time, God had allowed our son to hear his father's voice tell him one more time that he loved him. I grabbed my son's hand and I headed for the airport store. As I did, I said out loud, and I didn't care who heard me, "All right, George Randall Woodall, I will buy our son the Frogman." And I did.